Good evening and welcome to another episode of Pages to Progress. Well, it's evening for us, at least, wherever you are listening. Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on another episode. We are looking at the book by N.T. Wright. Matt, could you hold it up for us? If no, not Matt, because he's on blurred screen. Could you hold it up for us? Hold the book up for us so everyone can see. It's called Simply Jesus by N.T. Wright. Trust me to bring a British theologian into the pit, eh? We have already kind of reviewed the first two chapters, and today we're going to be looking at chapters 3, 4, and 5. Now, usually you would expect Darlene, you would expect Matt, and you would expect John to be on our episode. Unfortunately, John can't be with us this evening, and not as a replacement, but as an addition to this journey. We want to welcome James. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for being with us. We appreciate you taking the time to read with us, and we're looking forward to your thoughts and correct all our theologies, James. So without further ado, let's dive in. We're going to just review chapters 3, 4, and 5. So let's start off with this as a very broad summary, because this is a very heavy chapter with lots of content. N.T. Wright seems to place a positional perspective on the types of different opinions that existed back then in Jesus's time, and he contrasts that with the types of, well, he does it the other way around actually. He starts off with the types of contrasting opinions about Jesus in the here and now, with the types of contrasting opinions that took place at the time of Jesus. He uses the illustration of, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, a Massachusetts perfect storm. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. So apparently in 1991, there was this major storm that happened in Massachusetts. Do you guys know about this? You were aware? Okay. Me and my British self back in London, we were just sipping our tea. We had no idea these things were happening in 1991. Maybe it came on the news. I didn't really care so much about it, but
we watched a movie after.
Oh, you did? Oh, you did. Oh,
that's right, the movie.
I see. So you guys definitely understand him when he uses these metaphors. And maybe you can help me out. There was essentially a storm that came from the north, a storm that came from the southwest. Am I correct in saying that?
Southeast.
Yeah. Southeast, sorry.
I believe.
And there was a third one, which was pretty much like a hurricane that came from the west.
Was it southwest?
Yeah, I think that's right. Western winds,
right?
Northern high system pressure, and then
east.
Southeast hurricane. Yeah.
Sure. And when he kept mentioning all this high pressure, low pressure stuff, I was just like, yeah, whatever you say, because when the weather people describe these things, I just smile and nod because I have no idea what pressures, what that means. Anyway, I digress. He uses these as three illustrations of cultural perspectives or ideological perspectives or religious perspectives that come into contact with each other. And maybe we can talk a little bit about each of those perspectives. Let's start with the modern day perspective, which he starts to build a picture in chapter 3 of the perfect storm. I think the first one that he talks about that interplays in today's society is skepticism and versus conservatism that takes place in the here and now. The idea, I think, of what he presents is a very highly secularized culture upon which Jesus is eradicated from society because he logically doesn't actually make sense to the rational state of thinking. That's the way that I'm putting it out, that he kind of summarizes. And he talks about the nature of how religious thought literally rubs that up the wrong way. And a lot of people get very up in arms about it. What I found very interesting about this, speaking as a Brit who's still getting used to American politics, N.T. Wright really goes to town talking about the link between republicanism and Christian conservatism, which I'm sure you guys have a few things to say about that, but he draws a trend is what I think what he does. He draws a trend to say that most conservatives fall into the line as Republican thinkers, and liberals are on the complete opposite end of the scale. That might be a very basic way to surmise things, but he calls that to be in direct contest with a secularized society, or modern skepticism. Skepticism is maybe a better way to put it. And he basically charges these two things as against each other, stating that secularism, I can't even say the word, kind of accuses the Christian story to be a myth that kind of supports the illogical nature of some kind of fable that existed back then, which is no longer relevant for the here and now. Anyway, I've started the ball rolling with a few of my thoughts. I don't know if those are controversial or anything, but I just wanted to know, what are some of your thoughts about how he brought across the idea of secularism? Did it string up any thoughts for you? So the floor is open to James, D, or Matt. Who'd like to go first on some of your reflections?
I thought he was very accurate in describing the America's very much polarized state that we're living now, especially with politically, and actually really, I think it actually affects all aspects of our lives now, where, if you are a Christian, believing in the traditional Christian religion, you are really considered to be really, you are looked down upon, and you're made fun of, actually. And if you are on the other side, the secularism, where they believe that, oh yeah, Jesus was definitely not a God. He was maybe, if you wanted to give some respect to him, maybe he was a good teacher, good leader, whatever he was. But it's really gotten to the point where the country has so divided now that everything just seems to come down to that. It's either you are quote unquote religious and believe in the God and everything drives that affects all of your life, or you're on the completely opposite side. So very, very interesting. Growing up here, I never heard any politician even mention the name God in their speech or anything until 9/11 happened and George Bush started mentioning God and all that. And since then on, is really, I see it all the time now. I hear it all the time. We know where we're going with this, but yeah.
Coming new into the country, and I came at the time where elections kind of kicked off immediately. I jumped on the plane just when religious language was the norm in election campaigns. And for me, I was just like, oh yeah, that's just how America is. Sure. Until a lot of people told me, yeah, it wasn't always like that.
It wasn't like that.
But yeah, anyway, yeah. Thanks, Dee. Anyone else who'd like to share?
So I guess a couple things that maybe going a step beyond what he was saying, but very much in line kind of, he talks about this conflict between kind of secularism and Christianity. Where my mind went with it was, I guess, first of all, I'm not, he never used, I don't think he used this word, but fundamentalism.
Yeah, he was alluding to it.
Oh yeah, definitely.
It's kind of the
fanatic. He used the word fanatic.
Yeah, he did.
Fanatic.
Okay, so I mean, that certainly plays into it, but the idea of using fundamentalism and a fundamentalism interpretation of the Bible pairs up with that kind of political aspect that he was talking about. Maybe we get to it at the end of this chapter here, but I think it plays off of how he goes into discussing how he wants to interpret these stories of Jesus, which I thought was kind of interesting. But the one thought I kind of had is, he talks about this conflict between the two, about this conflict and this fight about Jesus and who is Jesus. And I can't help but thinking, is it really Jesus that we're really talking about here? It seems like Jesus is just a proxy that is being used as a name for this greater conflict that really is nothing about Jesus. I would say in this day and age, if you talk to most secular people, they're not going to have really probably a real deep informed opinion necessarily about theologically why they don't believe in this, but they'll certainly have opinions about the Christians who maybe drove them to their stance, right? And so is it really about Jesus that we're fighting, or, you know, is one hand using fundamentalism to attack the other one, back and forth? I don't know.
That's a really interesting point. When I first came here and I had my time to really assess my first impressions of living in America, this is just my personal opinion, and how I view things, but I see a large part of the American mindset who have politically decided on something first before they religiously decide on something, or they politically decide on something which informs their religious persuasions. Now, I know it's a sweeping statement I'm making, but maybe I'm making those statements at least to extreme fundamentalists on both sides.
Yeah, I would go a step farther and say it's almost that the politics has become the religion. It's not deferral to one. It is the core religion, with Jesus as a secondary.
Wow.
That's used as a cudgel to attack. So, or, you know.
Very interesting.
I mean, yeah, I agree with Matt in that. I think that Jesus is not mentioned directly. I think it's because we are living in a society where, you know, you have to respect or honor everyone else's spirituality, meaning not everyone believes in Jesus, not everyone's a Christian, but they all have they're connected to spirituality in some way. So I feel like we've gone that way where, you know, you can't just if you mention Jesus, you have to mention about, you know, Buddha and all kinds of other gods. So I think they just stay away from that. And if you're going to get attacked, it's not really Jesus that you're attacking. It is the people, the Christians, the followers. So
yeah. James, any thoughts on this chapter?
You know, just growing up in a very conservative environment in the East Coast, while attending very secular, as he said, skeptical schooling in public school, I always found just a struggle trying to reconcile how am I to be a Christian and hold these beliefs while understanding logically some of the things presented to me in science or in liberal arts courses. And I think it's important. It does bring up a good point that it's good to be aware of sort of these, you know, it may not be that black and white at times, but some of these different worldviews, I guess, if you want to call it that. But I think that I've always felt that somewhere in the middle, the truth is there, and you know, really, I want to be aware that there's these skeptical school of thoughts, these conservative school of thoughts, so that I don't find myself being influenced or just following these views without actually discovering who Jesus was for himself. Yeah. So I think it's a great introduction, and it makes me want to see what more he has to say about who Jesus really was.
Right. So if we can try and be clear, he's putting up three people in the ring, essentially, or three views in the ring. We've got secularism, we've got the state of Christianity, as is expressed by maybe fundamentalists or conservatives, if you want.
Conservatives.
Yeah. What's the third element that he is trying to bring across? What's the third part that contributes to the perfect storm in this day and age? Did you guys catch that?
Kind of the lack of information.
What he called a historical puzzle.
Right. Yeah. This was a little bit complex. No, well, I don't know if I am totally with him. Let me hear some of your thoughts before I offload. Matt, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I kind of alluded to this before. This kind of caught my eye, in that he doesn't outright name it, but he seems to use this introduction of the historical complexity of looking at Jesus as a way to basically kind of introduce this idea of like a historical critical approach to analyzing the Bible, where you're trying to view it knowing the background, right? Kind of I've kind of always heard it of the, the Bible, I'm gonna get this wrong, but the Bible wasn't written, it was written for us, but it wasn't necessarily written to us. And so you have to have the idea of what is the background when these authors are writing letters to each other. So, it's a very, and this is where I commented about the fundamentalism in my notes here, is that it's very almost anti-fundamentalism, because you're not necessarily taking it literal word for word, trying to understand the background. So
there's a preacher called Ty Gibson who terms it this way. He says, take the Bible, don't take the Bible literally, take it seriously, he says. And I think that's one of the things that N.T. Wright is trying to accomplish in this final third phase, where he's literally trying to say the third movement or third struggle of individuals are people who are desperately trying to stay contextually accurate to the interpretation of who this man Jesus was, rather than figure out what I believe and then use the Bible to support my beliefs by bringing it over with certain buzzwords. At least that's me describing it in a simplistic way. But I think the third hurricane, whatever you want to call it, the third wind, if you were, was that does come into direct contestation with a number of things, because when established beliefs have been so present, it's very difficult to try and change people from them. I'm going to give one quick example, but I realize I'm talking so much. I'll give you a funny example. So I turned up to I was pastor in a church in London, in England, and we all know that the normal Christian perspective, at least outside of Adventism, is that most people believe that when you die, you go to heaven, right? That's kind of like most people believe that. So we had this board at the back of church with a bunch of our kids from the Sabbath school and stuff. And they were depicting, essentially the second coming and in a creative way. And they had all these little ships with their faces in the ships on their way to heaven. And I think the inscription at the top of the board was on our way to see Jesus, or something like that, to celebrate that, they're on their way to see Jesus. It was cute. It was cool. And here's where we were tapped out of our context and the hilarity of it. We shared the space. We shared the space with a local school nursery, a kindergarten class that used to rent that space for their kindergarten school, non-religious, non-Christians. So these guys walk into the room, they see these pictures of kids' faces on these little ships heading upwards with the big sign that says on our way to meet Jesus. It's messing up their mind. And they actually complained, because according to their theology that they had inherited, we were trying to say, oh, wow, we're going to kill these kids so that they can go to heaven. But that was not our intention. We were just totally plugged out of our context and how we needed to just wise up and realize, oh, people don't actually know what we actually believe. Anyway, I tell that illustration to talk about the reality. It's very difficult to try and look at things in a particular way if we've looked at them in another way for such a long time. Sorry, I talked so much. Any other thoughts on this chapter?
I just have a last comment on the, talking about the conservative Christians and the nuances of, them possibly being referred to as fundamentalists. That word makes me very uneasy, in that, because when we talk about terrorists and terrorism, and we often refer to them as being fanatics and fundamentalists, and to think that just because you believe in this Jesus as being the God, who created the world and all of that comes with that, to think that we could be, seen as a fundamentalist and fanatics, it quite makes me uneasy.
Yeah,
I'm just being really transparent, honest.
No. I appreciate that. It doesn't take away from the fact why we would so often be branded as that, though.
Yeah.
I get it. I get it, because people are so
Yeah.
extreme on other levels.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift a little bit. N.T. Wright in chapter 4 now dives out of the 21st century, and he goes back in time, into the time machine, to where Jesus lived and walked and fashioned his ministry. So now we're still using the same analogy where he's talking about these winds that come from different directions, two in particular. So the two winds that he talks about in this section is, number one, it's the Roman rule that takes place at that time, which is essentially the oppressive force that is governing and lording over everything upon the Jews and everyone else for that matter. So we have a governmental slash neo-religious kind of force that's at bay, which is all inscribed into Greek thought and all that kind of thing. And the second is the very religious Jewish context, inherited from the Old Testament, and the whole Jewish system as is detailed. Now here are the two winds that are fighting against each other, and he just goes into detail to talk about each of those things. I found it quite helpful for N.T. Wright to be able to go into some of the details of what that actually meant to live in that time and be under Roman rule, for instance. He gave a very interesting history about the nature of the term Son of God in reference to Octavian, in reference to Augustus Caesar. The long and short of it is the Romans had coined Son of God long before the Christians had even got to the scene, which is why it was so contentious that the biblical writers made it a point to call Jesus the Son of God. And I can see those tensions outplay in so many different ways. Essentially, they saw the leader of the Roman free world as a god. And from that, there are all kinds of implications that are quite interesting. And the reason why I found that interesting is mainly because of what Matt just said recently in the last chapter about the political system being God itself in some respects, or being the central part of a religious organization itself. The political system is not necessarily termed that way, but it's almost subtly it's come across that way, which is very, very similar to the Roman system back then. Anyway, those are my initial thoughts. I thought that was quite striking. Any other thoughts?
I thought the parallelism between the Julius Caesar, the Roman, how his son, when Julius Caesar died, his son came about and said, yeah, basically Julius Caesar became a divine, and therefore he became the son of God, and he took on all of that, and just the whole Jewish story about waiting for this son of God, the Messiah, to come and rescue them, all of it. I mean, I guess honestly, the first thing that really, after reading all of that, popped into my head is, I don't know how, is counterfeit. Again, okay. I couldn't, honestly, I couldn't help thinking like Satan's work of counterfeit, how he, because he works through with people, and how he had worked through, the Romans to come up with this idea of Son of God, and how, historically all of that just mashed together. And I could see why the Romans were just so nervous about, Jesus and his work, and all these people following him, and, name him to be the king, right? This coming king. And I just made it very clear to me just how they must have been feeling at that time.
Right. Yeah. Definitely. Anyone else? I've got tons to say, but I need to give you guys the opportunity. Go for it.
Yeah, I appreciate this big overarching picture, this historical complexity of the environment and times where Jesus was born. I mean, if we continue that line of thought, again, I was thinking of the Screw Tape Letters as I read this, as thinking of, I'm sure Satan studied the scriptures. He knows exactly when Jesus is going to be born proximately, and to try to influence and create a storm to really thwart the entrance of the Son of God, the true Son of God, Jesus. It puts it into perspective how crucial a turning point in history of the universe, if not alone just our humanity. This was, Rome, so depicted as an iron fist. This was their golden age, as I remember in history. Under Caesar Augustus, that was the golden age of Rome, and Tiberius, his son, was just basically the new emperor when Jesus was living here. So for him to be born during this pinnacle of power for Rome, I think it's very telling that I mean it's just it's amazing to me that God chose this time, but I guess there's pros and cons, too. It was definitely a time where the famous Roman roads were created so that transportation and access from all parts of the empire was unprecedented. But I really liked the one point. I don't know if you're going to bring this up, where they compared the Roman storm with the Jewish nationalist storm.
Yes.
And he termed, I never thought of it this way. The Romans had a retrospective eschatology versus the Jewish prospective eschatology. And it makes so much sense. I mean, if you watch like movies like The Gladiator, they had like festivals and shows, reenactments of their defeats of Carthage, and they were just looking back at how do we become this great nation, prospective eschatology. Whereas the Jewish nation, retrospective, where the Jewish nation were thinking prospectively that the coming of a Messiah, the new kingdom to restore the temple and the glories of Jew, and they're still waiting actually today. But it's just so interesting how that difference there. But yet they both were off. They missed the mark. They both missed Jesus for truly who he was, for different reason, whether you see one as secular and the other as ultra conservative. But okay, yeah, those are my thoughts.
Thanks. You gave us a good segue into the Jewish perspective. Matt, did you want to weigh in on that perspective as well?
Yeah, I kind of, one thing I scribbled down there is I thought that was really interesting, a view based on, and I could almost see it applying from a Jewish standpoint, retrospectively, they had all of this history with the Exodus and Abraham and Isaac, and there was a lot that they could almost look back on, but then that guided their view towards hope. But I guess the thing that I scribbled down there is, what would Jesus have looked at, between the two of those? And I kind of wonder, would he have maybe, that the verse that came to mind, the kingdom of God is at hand, would he have looked at a present day eschatology almost, right? I don't know. That was what.
Yeah, that's a great point.
That's really interesting. It got me thinking also about the audacity of the claims of Scripture as well. I'm going to specifically bring up Mark chapter 1 and verse 1. Mark was written to the Gentiles, and the text says, "This is the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God." Like, just such a bold introduction like that was said on purpose to irritate people. It was said on purpose to let them know we pay no homage and allegiance to what you call divine. And that juxtaposed with the Jewish fixation upon freedom and the idea that God is a God who saves them from the oppressors has become the fundamental narrative, even today, even for modern Jews, that has kind of seeped into our Christianity as well, because it's been so thematic in the way that we bring across our eschatology. Jesus is coming to save us. Therefore, who cares about what happens in the here and now is the dangerous thought that can go over and over. And when I read about N.T. Wright's reflections about how the Jews understood the Old Testament teachings implemented for their modern time back then, I understood the nature of why we're so sometimes fixated upon a saving God who will overthrow all the bad energies that have been around us. Now, I'm not saying that Jesus isn't going to do that. I'm just saying the fixation moves us away from understanding who the man Jesus is. And it just makes us focus on this warlike theological path. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yeah, you're making sense. I also, because I also found it very interesting how, throughout all the history of Israelites, how they're just as a nation, it was always up and down, right? They had great times and they had the lows and the highs. And throughout it all, and in the beginning, they had actually rejected God as their king, right? And asked for human king. And now finally, here there, after going through all that up and down, one thing they did come to truly realize is that the God being the king is the best and much, much better than having an actual human king. They did come to realize that, right? And they did come to realize that that's what's gonna truly bring prosperity, glory back, and all that. And so they've been just waiting and waiting for that. Yeah.
Well,
one lesson they've learned.
Well, you gave us a perfect segue into the final chapter 5, because the interpretation of Christ as king was not the interpretation that they thought their Messiah of king would be. At least their earthly kings had ascribed to a certain thing. They just wanted they just wanted a bigger bully to come and bully the other bullies, basically. And then we hit chapter 5, the final wind or hurricane, as N.T. Wright talked about. And I think this long chapter that he writes, long because it was so punctuated with the themes that he was noticing throughout scripture about God's kingly position, or Jesus's kingly status that he wants to try and introduce into humanity to accomplish what we as human beings never thought he could accomplish in a way that we would never expect it. And I think the final chapter, or chapter 5, was N.T. Wright basically making a case he's not the king that you think he is. And I think I had to take a long, hard look and realize, and I do this on a daily basis, I think, he's not the Jesus I think he is. I have expectations about the kind of God that I want to rescue me. But this God somehow doesn't operate like other kings in the past. What do you guys think of the final chapter 5?
Yeah, oh wow. He N.T. Wright is obviously a very accomplished New Testament scholar, and I just love how he put together all these verses extensively that were prophetic pointings towards Jesus. But I think it would be arrogance on my part to think that, had I lived at that time, I would have recognized that he was going to come in human form and marry heaven and earth in the way that he did. And I mean, when we look, knowing what we know now, I mean, things like, when he quotes Zechariah, where Zechariah literally says he's going to come humbly, riding on a donkey. I mean, literally, and that literally happened. But no one in their right mind would have thought that God, the omnipotent God, would have actually taken human form and come as king. I mean,
but sorry to cut you, James.
You
can understand why people would look at that and say, yeah, that's just a metaphor.
Exactly. So, boy, the challenge for me now is here in 21st century. Do I make the mistakes similarly of as we look at maybe apocalyptic and scriptures and Revelation of Jesus' second coming? Will I make similar mistakes of assuming things, assuming based on my own culturally influenced or skeptical or conservatively influenced ideas of how Jesus will wrap things up here?
So if I may,
I'm losing my thought here.
No, it's fine. I think what you are trying to allude to is a challenge. I don't think NT Wright says it out loud, but he's getting there and amping up to it. I think he's challenging us to remove the conventional lenses that we are used to in seeing Jesus how we have been presented to him. Ellen White has this amazing quote. I'm going to quote her incorrectly, but the premise of the quote is something like, truth does not lose its value under closer inspection. And I think that's what NT Wright is trying to push for here. He's just trying to say, let's just home in on this and let's just put aside what you think you believe is truth and let's get to know what the real man is about. Sorry, Dee, I know you want to mention something.
No. I was just going to say, I understand what James is saying. I think that something along the line of what James is thinking is, for me, I don't know, in the past several years, I think a couple of years maybe, I've been trying to rethink or trying to understand better, or trying to understand outside of the traditional way that we've been taught about how the end time will come and what will happen in end time. I mean, yes, I still believe in the revelation, how it's written, but I'm trying to like look beyond that, because I think that I think it may also be true that it's going to come in a way that's going to be quite different and surprising to us, and not in a way necessarily that's been taught to us in a very traditional, dogmatic way. I think. I don't know if I'm making.
No, you're making total sense. You're making total sense.
Yeah.
Matt, did you want to weigh in as well?
I'm glad you two went first, because I was going to apologize and saying that what I really got out of this chapter was the idea of prophecy and how it can be a wonderful thing and in some ways a curse, because when we give into the idea that we want to define and control God, we make him a small God. And when God was coming to say he's gonna, I had to reread some of these verses, especially the ones in Psalms, several times, because I could see where he was saying that the Jews could see this as God was coming to, liberate and save the Jews. And I'm like, I guess that view is there, but at the same time, you look at it and he's speaking of like the whole world. He's talking about humanity, and we can. It's not a Jewish problem, it's a human problem where we try to define God and it makes him small because it makes him based on our feelings, our story. And it just is I don't know. The other thing I kind of wonder then is I play around with this idea. I think how much with prophecy and how much does God have to adjust that prophecy based on us? And do we ever lose out because we've made him so small that suddenly he can't work through us anymore and he has to blow it up and go a different route? And is that what happened? Like, I don't know, thought experiment. We never, may never know, for who knows. But
you bring such a really important point. I mean, you guys are married, so you must understand at least the basic concept of active listening when it comes to to who you're married to, or the idea, at the very least, of listening to what your spouse says without feeling the need to bring up some kind of one of your own experiences to say, oh yeah, I totally get you because this is exactly what happened to me. No, but it isn't though. It's just, it's something you've experienced, but in that moment, all that is required for you, at least from the modern rules of healthy relationships, is to shut up and listen and empathize in that moment and let them tell their story. It's a bit like God is trying his best to have a conversation with us, and we're like, yeah, it's just like when we were there, we were oppressed by the Egyptians, and you never guess what, God came in and saved. It's just like, and God is like, yeah, kinda, but it's a bit bigger than that. It's a lot larger than that. And I understand why even the modern Jews are so focused on the Holocaust narrative being the entire narrative. It's not that I'm minimizing what happened to them as a heinous crime and awful, but we do the same. We do the same in our own Adventist narrative. And I feel like part of the Adventist narrative is somewhat under the it's almost like everyone is against us, and therefore we need to try and protect the sanctity and sacredness of what we have. But God is so much bigger than all of that. He's trying to say something so much more huge. And maybe this, our time has gone because we're so excited about this chapter, but let me end my final thoughts. If you guys want to add with a teaser of what I think N.T. Wright is trying to give us as to what's coming later. On page 50, kind of 2/3 of the way down, he poses some questions that we will, I guess, go into the depths of, which I'm excited about. Here are the questions. The idea of Yahweh alone as king is expressed by the extreme revolutionaries in the first century, thus raises a big question. Here are some of the questions. What will this mean in practice, in reality? What does it look like? How does all this line up, if it does, with the national expectation of hope? Will it underwrite it? Will it overthrow it? Or will it perhaps do both of those at the same time? And I think what N.T. Wright wants to try and tease out is Jesus made such an impact in his day and age, and technically he is dead, risen, and gone. Technically, what does that mean for us now about a historical Jesus that impacts our lives on a daily basis? Yeah, my final thoughts. Does anyone want to add anything before we wrap up? Anything that really came out for you and struck a chord?
I mean, this is nothing new. I mean, but again, it did strike a chord that in reading through this, I found it to be very sad that the Jews, with their religious and national pride, they truly failed to recognize the Son of God, and recognize God's true purpose of not only saving them, but really through them, he was going to save the whole entire world. But they became so inward focused that they completely failed. And I was thinking that I hope that we as Seventh-day Adventists, and me just as a Christian person, will not be like that. That it would truly be a huge failure on our part if we become like that.
Well, amen. I think that charge is very relevant to us. Anyone else wants to add anything? Okay. All right. Well, for those of you who don't hear my prep before we start, I say to these guys, let's just talk for half an hour. And I think Dee already knows that's never going to happen.
Never going to happen.
Don't even bother. But I think this really gives testament to the fact that there's so much meat in what we're reading. And I think that there's so much to be discussed here. We'd love to invite you, dear listeners and watchers, on the journey to come with us. Dee, could you just show the book again? We are reading through N.T. Wright, Simply Jesus. In the description link, you can click the link and it will take you to where you can find the book. Come join us. We've hit chapter 5. We're going to continue to read a few more chapters next week and the week after and the week after. And we're going to work our way through this book bit by bit. I think there's a lot of value that N.T. Wright brings to the table that we can really just soak up. And it really, I hope and pray, will do very good to your spiritual life as it brings us closer to the ultimate one true Son of God, Jesus Christ. So from us this evening, we wish you a happy good evening or afternoon or good morning, and we'll see you next episode. God bless you.